All right. Well, welcome, Michael. It's a real pleasure to be here talking with you about your new book, How to Work with Almost Anyone. I know you said almost anyone because not everyone.
That's right. Thanks, Roz. It's nice to be here.
Yeah. Look, let's kick off. I'd like to really understand from you, what was the inspiration for the book? Was there a particular moment or a situation that you had, or is it just kind of a cumulative effect of working with people for many years?
It was there's a long and a short answer to that. A kind of a seed planted many years ago, and then a catalyst that made me want to write this particular book. 20 years ago, I'd been introduced to a concept by another writer in the space called Peter Block, called social contracting. And it's the core idea that's in the book, which is have a conversation about how you work together before you get into the work itself. And social contract always felt a bit abstract and high level for me, but I'd been using it for 20 years to try and build more resilient, more enjoyable working relationships with people on my team and clients and vendors and the like. And so I knew it was a useful tool, and I was thinking that maybe it'd be helpful to write a book around it to share it more widely. And then a couple of years ago, as I was starting to write a new book, I actually found my way back to Australia, back to Canberra, in fact, where my dad was dying. And, I was living in my childhood home in Torrens. Mum and dad were there together. Dad was in a hospital bed. We knew he had a terminal illness. And as you can guess, it was kind of a bit miserable in the house. Mum and dad were doing their best, but they were kind of niggling at each other a little bit for all the obvious stressful reasons. And in a moment of unexpected courage, I went, let's have a conversation about how you want to be with each other in the remaining weeks or months of dad's life, because I knew enough about how memory worked, which is to say the recency effect. The last few moments of a relationship will color your whole memory of it. And I didn't want mum's final memories of her relationship with dad to color what had been a really fabulous 55-year relationship. So we had that conversation, and that was the immediate catalyst that said, this book is going to be helpful for people.
Mm. Yeah, I read that story in the book, and, it's sad that it came from that place, but I think it's such a wonderful resource for any kind of relationship. And it kind of validated for me a little bit of what I've, done in my teams and in my business now, which is that I always ask people, tell me about how you want to work. What works for you? How do you want to be communicated with? I'm a Myers-Briggs type indicator practitioner, so we do MBTI to find out what their preferences are and work around that. But this book gives it real structure, which I really like, which is a formula to follow to go, let's work out how we best work together to make this work for both of us.
Yeah, people intuitively get that that's a helpful thing to do, but it's actually quite hard to stop in the moment and have that conversation. It's a discipline and it takes practice. And if all you take from this interview already is going, hey, just stop and go, hey, how should we work together? Then you've already won. That's a great thing to take away. But what's in the book are like 5 good questions to kind of structure it, and some ideas around how you do maintenance after you have that keystone conversation. So I'd love to make what is a rare conversation a little less weird, a little more common, a little more practical for people.
Yeah. So given the 5 questions, which, I've read the book, so I know, but for the audience who haven't, do you want to take us through the 5 questions and a little bit about them and basically how they help sort of practical applications of?
Yeah. So let me pull back to the bigger picture before I get into the 5 questions. And the bigger picture is the goal is to build the best possible relationship with the key people in your working life. It's not trying to build the best relationship, because as much as we would love all our working relationships to be glorious moments of light-filled joy, we're going to have a bell curve of people we work with. Some are great, some are pretty hard, most are in the middle. Our working relationships are such a big indicator and driver of our, not just our success, but our happiness. So it's like, so how do you actively shape all of your working relationships to try and make all of them the best possible expression, the best possible version of that relationship? And this idea of the keystone conversation about how you work together is at the heart of it, and 5 questions. So the first question is starting with it's called the amplify question. And it's like, what's your best? And it's deliberately not what are you good at, because that can actually be a bit limiting and a bit boring. And it's not what are your values or even what is your Myers-Briggs profile or your DISC profile or anything like that, which are all kind of labels and can feel a bit abstract. Like I know that if I tell people that, for instance, I'm an ENFP in Myers-Briggs, most people are like, I'm delighted for you, but I don't really know what to do with that. Whereas what's your best is tell me when you shine, tell me when you flow. Tell me when I get to see the very best of who you are and what that even is. And now let me tell you when I shine and when I flow. And immediately you're off to an interesting start, which is like, now that we know what each other's best is, we might actually try and do something to try and get there more often and avoid the things that don't bring that out.
Yeah, and find that intersect where we're both at our best. Find work we can do where we can both bring our best to the table.
Exactly. Or, I mean, and it may not be possible all of the time, but, if I'm working with you, Roz, and I'm like, oh, well, I've known Roz for 10 minutes so far. I don't know her at all, but I've made up a whole bunch of stuff about her immediately because that's what we do. We kind of go, okay, well, I can see this and I can guess that. And she's wearing that type of shirt and she's got that kind of bookshelves behind her. This is what I think is probably going on for Roz. I'm like, I don't know anything. But when Roz goes, let me tell you what just makes me delighted and makes me excited and gets me really going, I'm like, okay, as much as I can, let me see if I can find ways of actually bringing that into her purview, into her space. The second question is the steady question, and it's really about what are the mechanics of how you work? What are the practicalities? Because we've all developed our preferences, our practices and our preferences around how we like to work. And they all seem sensible enough to us, but they're kind of quirky and they're not always that obvious. And it is amazing how when people don't get how you like to work, how irritating that can be. As a really practical example, I use a project management software called Asana to help manage my projects and to-do list. And so when I'm working with my team and with my assistant, Claudine in particular, I tell them right at the start, if you're giving me a to-do, it has to start with a verb. Like I learned this from a guy called David Allen years ago. He wrote a book called Getting Things Done 25 years ago or something. And he's like, if it's an action, it needs to start with an action word. That's a verb. So I was like, oh, that's actually really helpful. Now I get unreasonably irritated when somebody gives me a to-do list where I'm like, I don't know what to do. It's give me a collection of nouns or a statement of intention. I'm like, give me a verb so I know what the thing is I'm doing. So it's a very small thing, but it's helpful just to go, look, this is my name. These are my pronouns. This is how I like to have meetings. This is how I like feedback. This is when I work best. This is when I don't work best. This is what it means when I send you an email at 6 p.m. on a Saturday. As another small example, and we did this just before we hit record. My name is Michael Bungay Stanier. It's a slightly complicated name because when I got married, I took my wife's name. I was just Michael Stanier. I became Michael Bungay Stanier. Bungay Stanier is my surname. There's no hyphen. People get weirded out on how to pronounce it. It's like I got a letter once to Michael Banging Spaniel. So like people get freaked out by it. I don't like to be called Mike. I do prefer Michael. This is all minor stuff. But I tell you what, when people unilaterally decide to call me Mike, I'm like, I start twitching. I get that little vein in my forehead start pulsating. So an opportunity just to trade some of those bits of information just helps the relationship stay clean and clear. Then the third and fourth questions are the good date and the bad date questions. So they kind of go together. And the key insight is what happened in our past, the patterns will repeat again in our future. So figure out what those patterns are. The first question, the good date question, is what can we learn from successful past relationships? And the bad date question is what can you learn from frustrating past relationships? Because there's just a big, big clue there as to what you need to do to make your future relationship together both successful and not frustrating. And then the fifth and final question is the repair question, which is how will we fix it when things go wrong? And the power in that is a recognition that things will go wrong. It happens in every working relationship, that The relationships that last tend to be the ones that get repaired. And thirdly, most of us kind of suck at repairing broken relationships. Where we avoid them, we pretend it's not happening, we resign ourselves to the fact that this always happens. And how will we fix it when things go wrong is a statement of intent that A, we are committed to this, and B, we will keep an eye out for it when things go wrong, and C, we'll see if we can make it better.
Mm. And I particularly love that bit of it because that's the guts of it, isn't it? The fact that relationships do go wrong, no matter how good the relationships are, there's always going to be a pinch point in it. And if we've talked about before we get there about how we're going to handle it when it happens, it's so much more likely that we'll come out of it, well. And look, I occasionally do reconciliation work in organizations with relationships that have gone horribly, horribly wrong. Right. And the majority of them are just misunderstandings. And it's just preference stuff like, I prefer you do it this way and you've done it that way. And eventually we start to hate each other because of it. And then it turns into a bullying complaint, for example. But so much can be avoided with this. How do we deal with things when it isn't working? And I really love that about the book.
So there's a bunch of the earlier questions are, let's just make some things clear. So all of these misunderstandings, we have a better chance of sidestepping them. Because you're right, it's amazing how a small thing becomes a massive irritant. And so often the damage in relationships is not some kind of actual big blow up. It is a misunderstood word, a misunderstood expectation or preference, a bad day where you say something thoughtlessly and carelessly and you didn't really mean it, but it gets taken in a certain way. And it's remarkable how fragile we often are in our relationships, working and otherwise. And part of the power of this is, there's a kind of a bigger win to having this keystone conversation. The short-term win and the immediate win is like you get to understand the person in the moment. But the bigger win is you're both saying this relationship matters enough for us to work on the relationship. We now have permission to keep coming back to and thinking about our working relationship together, rather than what most of us do is we just cross our fingers and hope for the best.
Yeah. These kinds of conversations take a degree of vulnerability from leaders in particular. For sure. Do you think we're there yet?
I think, there's in some organizations and some leaders, there are people who are willing to do this. So you're absolutely right. This is about vulnerability. And, Brené Brown, amongst others, have shown us that, vulnerability is strength. And one of the great acts of leadership is a degree of vulnerability. And she's also very clear that, vulnerability isn't revealing everything or falling to pieces all the time. It's about understanding how much of yourself you're willing to actually share and give. And so there's a tentativeness on both sides of this, leaders going, I don't know how much of me do I want to share, and people on the other side, the more junior people, going exactly the same. How much of me do I want to share? How much am I protecting myself? But my sense is it kind of speaks to some of the bigger dynamics about what makes an organization successful. They talk about culture and strategy as the twin DNA of a successful organization. And, the saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's one of the great Peter Drucker misquotes, because he never said that, but people think he did. And it kind of makes a point, which is no point in having a great strategy if you don't have a great culture that is going to deliver that strategy in a distinct, purposeful way. And a great strategy is the best type of people doing their best work. And to get the best type of people doing their best work, you need to actually treat them as humans. And what this is an act of humanity within an organization, which is to say, who are you as a human? Let me tell you who I am as a human. Let's see what we can do together as humans around that. And there is a degree of vulnerability. And so when you have a conversation like this, as you feel your way into it, you'll become more confident about what's appropriate to share and how vulnerable you're willing to be. But so often, you can talk about who you are at your best, without having to reveal any dark secrets. You can talk about your practices and preferences without having to reveal any dark secrets. You can talk about your best working relationships from the past without having to reveal any dark secrets. The bad one is where it starts getting a bit vulnerable, where you're like, let me tell you how I've screwed up past relationships and how I've contributed. But my goodness, what a gift that is to be heard on the other side of things. And the repairability is also a statement around vulnerability, which is like, hey, it's going to break. It's going to be awkward. It's going to be a bit messy. It's easier to talk about it before it gets messy than when it actually does get messy.
Yeah. And that builds trust, obviously. But I think it's that thing of being able to say it is going to go wrong and this is, I'm not going to get this right. And that's a big piece of vulnerability from leaders because we've got this sort of almost traditional model of leadership that says that leaders are all seeing, all knowing, we get it right all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Reality is we don't. So I think it's getting back to that thing of being able to, and you mentioned it in the book, that sort of relationships are safe, vital, and repairable. And the safe bit is the really critical bit, which is how do we create that psychological safety so people feel comfortable admitting when they've made a mistake or telling us they've messed something up. And you don't get that unless you can have these important conversations. But they've got to be role modeled by leaders because we can't sit in our ivory tower and expect other people to have vulnerable conversations with us.
Yeah. And I guess I would build on that by saying, so everybody gets a choice to be a leader, of course. In some ways, the more senior you become, the easier it is to do. In some ways, the harder because you've got more status and more authority and more kind of public showing about who you are. So you can, wherever you sit, you can always make an argument that it's harder for you than it is for other people. It's hard for everybody. But, I tend to think often in terms of subcultures and team cultures, which is like, okay, so you and your team, forget the culture, forget the organization. How about you and the people that you need to work with and you and the people in your team? What can you do to build the best possible relationships with almost everybody? And the title, I mean, of all the books I've written, this is the one where the title is the best title because everybody goes exactly, almost everybody. Almost. So let's work on the assumption that there's a few people that you're like, I don't think I could ever figure that out. And I'm like, great. So let's put those people aside. That leaves everybody else, all of your other key working relationships. So pick one to start with. It might be one that's a disaster where you're like, I've got nothing left to lose because it's actually already a disaster. It might be one where you we already have some great safety and bravery. So this is about trying to refine what we've already got and make it even better, but start somewhere.
Yeah. One of the things I really enjoyed about the book was the toolkits that you provide. We've actually given questions to step through and QR codes to scan to go and get resources elsewhere. And I think that's a huge value add because it's turning it from theoretical into deeply practical, which I'm assuming was the intent when you wrote it, to give people the actual toolkit for this.
Yeah, look, I figured out how I write a good book, and it's trying to unweird something. So, the book I'm best known for is called The Coaching Habit. And in some ways it unweirds coaching for regular managers and leaders, which is like, oh, I thought coaching was a kind of weird, touchy-feely HR thing. But if this is coaching, I can do that. And I can see how that's useful for the person and useful for me. And so I'm trying to do the same with this idea of, well, what is psychological safety? Here's a practical way of doing that. And for me, I'm like, ideas are great, but you've got to show me how to do it. I want people to change their behavior as a result of these books. And that's why, for me, a book is most helpful if it's a doorway into some other sort of support material. So you're right. There's stuff people can download. There's me role modeling a keystone conversation, videos that people can watch as well.
It's a great resource.
Thanks.
Now, you mentioned The Coaching Habit, which is one that's, sitting on my bookcase. I love it.
Thank you.
And your TERA model in that, which is, really, can you talk to us about that? Because I think that's actually really valuable. It was mentioned in this book as well, but I think it's a huge takeaway.
Thanks. Yeah. The TERA model, TERA, is all about the neuroscience of engagement. And so if you're a leader or if you're just a human being that interacts with other human beings, it's just very helpful to understand a fundamental biological process that is happening. And it starts with the fact that your brain and their brain and everybody's brain 5 times a second at an unconscious level is scanning the environment and going, is it safe here or is it dangerous? Safe or dangerous? Safe or dangerous? Risk or reward? And it's doing that for solid survival reasons, because the brain's job is to keep you alive. Because the longer you live, the more chance there's your DNA will get to pass on to the next generation. So the brain's going, look, you're a weird thing that I'm stuck in, but I'm going to try and keep you alive as long as possible. So safe or dangerous.
Yeah, don't do something dumb.
Don't do something dumb. And it's got 4 key ways of understanding what might be safe or what might be dangerous in the environment. So T stands for tribe. And the brain is basically going, are you with me or are you against me? You know, when it's trying to ascertain, you know, if I'm looking at Roz as I am through the video camera now, I'm like, part of my brain is going, safe or dangerous, safe or dangerous. So, you know, Roz and I are keeping eye contact and we're nodding enthusiastically at each other and we're kind of mirroring each other. We're doing all these things to say, I'm with you, I'm not against you. So that's the first question, is like, am I with you or am I against you? And so as a leader, you're going, what do I need to do to signal that I'm with them rather than against them? And that's everything from how you interact in a Zoom call, where you sit in a table in person, how often you laugh together. If you just touch them a little bit, appropriately touch them, like on their shoulder and stuff, there's a little connection. Do you disagree with them? Do you use we rather than I? You know, there's all sorts of ways that you can kind of up the terror, the tribiness of an interaction. The second driver is expectation. So the brain is going, do I know what's about to happen or do I not know? If it can see a little bit into the future, then it's going to feel a little safer. So, you know, if you're a facilitator, you're constantly saying, okay, next 10 minutes, this is what we're going to cover. And you can just feel everybody's brain in the room go, oh, good, I know what the next 10 minutes is about. So you're constantly saying, hey, let me tell you what this is about. The third driver is R for rank. So tribe, expectation, rank. And rank, the brain is going, are you more or less important than me? And if I am more important than you, that's a bit threatening. If you're more important than me, you feel safer. If we're about the same, we feel safer. So now you're thinking, so how do I increase the other person's rank? And that's everything from giving them a greater sense of control around what's going on. It's one of the reasons why asking questions, being coach-like, staying curious is so powerful, because if I'm giving you advice, I have the high rank. If I'm asking you a question, I'm inviting you to take the high rank because you get to figure out the answer yourself. Often, one of the great ways of playing with rank is self-deprecation, particularly if you have quite a lot of rank. So one of the things that I'm always conscious of, because I'm now a middle-aged, tall, white man, heterosexual, successful author, Rhodes Scholar, blah, 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 blah. I kind of come loaded down with status. So I've got a lot of rank to kind of give away to try and balance things out. People who have different profile from me, people of color, women, people who are not cis, sexuality, all of that sort of stuff, have a different thing to wrestle with, which is like, how much of my status do I play with? But rank is, are you more or less important than me? And you're trying to raise the rank of the other person. And then the fourth and final driver is autonomy. And the brain's going, do I have any say in this, or are you making all the choices for me? So, you know, as a teacher and a facilitator, I'm constantly trying to give people the choice, small choices, whilst not losing control altogether. Like, you know, if I'm running a workshop, say, I'm like, I know it needs to start at 9 and finish at 12. I know we need to have a break here. I know we need to cover this kind of key content, but I'm constantly giving small choices so people feel a greater sense of autonomy, so they feel safer and more in control, so they stay more engaged. Because the brain is going, if it feels dangerous, disengage. If it feels safe, engage. So the neuroscience of engagement, TERA, T-E-R-A, tribe, expectation, rank, and autonomy.
Yeah, it's so critical, isn't it? And with the facilitation example, I facilitate as well. And it's that giving the people the choice, like we're going to do an activity, you can draw if you like, or you can write it down. You know, here's
Exactly.
a choice of Technicolor.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and what's interesting about that is there's often you make a decision and it will increase part of the terror quotient and decrease it. So if I say to you, all right, Roz, go find somebody in the room to pair up with. So I'm now giving you choice. So you now have choice as to who you pair up with. Oh, great. That's high on autonomy. And then I go, great, you're going to answer a question. And the question is, what's the best meal you've had in your life? The person with the longest hair gets to go first. So now I'm giving a great deal of expectation, which is like, here's the topic and here's who's going first. So expectation goes up, but autonomy goes down. So expectation and autonomy often are in a dance with each other, and tribe and rank are often in a dance with each other as well. So you're playing with all of that, but the overall goal is, have I increased this sense of, as I think of it, the terror quotient to try and increase engagement?
I think the rank one's really important. In terms of that, how do we let go of status as leaders in order to allow people to feel that, that they've got the space, or they've got that, ability to speak, or whatever it is. And, I think, and again, you mentioned this in the book, emotional contagion, which is how do we set the mood for the conversations that we have? And,
right.
I know how important this is, having, read the research and so on around, emotions are deeply contagious, and the emotion of the leader is most contagious of all. And you can see that when you watch someone walk into a room and change the tone of the room just by their very presence. It might just be the look on their face, changed it completely. So any advice for people on how they can go about setting the right tone for having these conversations?
Well, the phrase you're using, which is a great one, is emotional contagion. My friend Mark Bowden says, be the strongest signal in the room. And that's such a helpful phrase for me, because I'm like, okay, people are influenced by the strongest signal in the room. I am possibly going to be the strongest signal in the room. So what is the signal I want to give? And this requires a degree of, you could call it emotional intelligence or self-awareness, which is like, so how are you showing up? And some of it you learn just through feedback, because so often we show up and we're kind of unconscious of what's leaking from us. One of the things that I learned is that when I am listening and trying to figure out an idea somebody's sharing with me, I kind of get a grumpy look on my face. I look serious, slightly angry, slightly pissed off, slightly disappointed.
My thinking face.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember a colleague just saying, "Oh yeah, I've been really nervous about sharing this with you." And I'm like, "Wow, this is great." She's like, "Yeah, but you look so angry." I'm like, "I'm the least angry person in the world. I mean, you've literally never seen me get angry." But she's like, "Yeah, but." And I'm like, oh, okay. So now I know to kind of, if I'm listening, I'm like, okay, I'm kind of, what from inside my brain feels like overemphasizing positivity. Like I'm smiling, I'm nodding, I'm kind of trying to radiate positivity. So
I got exactly that feedback years ago when I had somebody in my team, quite a young lady at the time. She was terribly excited about an idea, and she'd rushed in to tell me all about it. And she got about halfway through, and then her face just dropped, and she said, "You hate it, don't you?"
yeah,
and I'm like, "No, this is amazing. Tell me more." And she's like, "No, you really hate it. I can tell from your face."
Right. So we make up stuff about that all the time. So some of it is learned, most of it is learned habits around how do you self-manage, how do you self-regulate to be the presence you want to be. So first of all, you need to figure out what is the presence you want to be. Like I know that I'm typically going, I want to be encouraging, I want to be generous, I want to be clear, I want to be affirming. Those are all things that I'm looking for. I want to be open. I want to be reducing my status as often as possible. And if you watch, so I mentioned Mark Bowden. He has this great TEDx talk called something about body language. So his name, Mark Bowden, Bowden. And you can watch that because he gives you all sorts of guidance in that about non-verbal cues to change the mood in a room. And for him, it's positioning of hands. So he has something called the truth plane. And he says, look, when you're talking, the more you can keep your hands at kind of belly button height. So I'm going to adjust my camera so you can kind of see, kind of like speaking like that. That is the place of most vulnerability and most kind of relaxed confidence. And what's great about it is, and weirdly, if you're doing this, you are signaling to yourself that you are relaxed and confident. So it makes you more relaxed and confident. Now, I can shift the energy in a conversation just by moving my hands from down here to moving them up here. Because just by lifting my hands to this thing, if you're watching me visually, the energy bumps up. And then if I go like this, I am still talking about exactly the same thing in exactly the same way, but somehow this is like a more exciting conversation than if I'm talking with my hands down here. So these are learned tactics to say you need to understand how you leak different kind of energies, and you need to figure out what the energies you want so that you can have that and hold that presence that you're striving for.
I think it's really important too for leaders to, for a moment before they go into an interaction, to just think about, how do I feel right now? And is that going to be the most useful thing going in? Because busy people rush from meeting to meeting without really thinking about what's the energy I'm bringing with me to this next interaction. So that pause to go, how do I need to be in this next moment? And then how do I actually shift myself to that?
Exactly. How do you set yourself to be the person you want to be and need to be in this upcoming meeting, rather than kind of just rushing in and thinking that you're showing up neutrally? You're probably not showing up neutrally.
And it's because behavior is a choice. The emotion is a data set, as we know. It's just a piece of information. We don't have to act on it. So because we feel rushed and hurried doesn't mean we need to display rushed, hurried when we get there. We can go, I'm feeling rushed and hurried, but I can take a deep breath and, like you said, change my body language, go in looking more constructive.
Yeah. And sometimes it's useful just to tell on yourself, which is you can say, hey, I'm sorry, I know I'm feeling a bit rushed and hurried, and I'm probably radiating that a bit, but actually I'm interested and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, that's great. Naming it up is fantastic. Again, getting back to these conversations, and the more we can talk about what's going on for us as humans, the more likely it will resonate with other people and create great outcomes.
Yeah. So in the How to Work with Almost Anyone book, it's a book written for a business audience. Like if you work with other people, this could be helpful. But it's kind of a self-help book hidden inside it, because each of the 5 questions has 3 exercises connected to the question for you to kind of develop your own language and insight about who you are, so you can then communicate that to other people.
Now, you also talk about the maintenance of the relationship, which I think is really important, because there's so many books on difficult conversations, for example, that just go, here's how to have the difficult conversation, and not necessarily about how to maintain it in the longer term. So you've got 6 principles of maintenance. Do you mind talking us through those?
Yeah. So there's a kind of 3 principles around how you want to be, and then there are 3 principles around what you want to do. So the principles on how to be, I'll just kind of keep type level, but it's like you want to be open-minded, open-hearted, and open-handed, which is to basically say, stay generous, stay kind, stay curious, around that. So often what moves you into conflict is when you are not generous, and when you're not kind, and when you're not curious. You kind of figured it all out, and you've objectified that other person, and you've decided that they're the enemy. So it doesn't mean rolling over. It doesn't mean diminishing your power in this, but this gift around staying open-hearted and open-minded and open-handed in terms of its generosity is a really powerful stance. It kind of connects a little bit back to what we were just saying around your presence in the room. It's like, imagine every time you walked into a room, you radiated a sense of kindness and curiosity and generosity. That would be a pretty great presence to have as a person in an organization. And then the practicality of maintenance, one is around adjusting always. So I'm not a sailor, but I've got this idea that, if you're a sailor, you're constantly trimming the sails and tapping the tiller just to sort of steady the craft, because things keep shifting. So there's this way of, like, you keep kind of seeing the other person and kind of adjusting to each other. The second principle is to repair often.
Yeah.
So the idea is that there's probably ongoing minor disagreements and disappointments that happen. And the more that you can be nuanced and active about that, the more you can speak up about that, then the better chance you have of quickly fixing something when it's small, rather than letting it fester and brew and become big and miserable and hard and difficult and irreconcilable.
Mm.
And then the third principle and final principle is to reset as needed, which means sometimes ending a relationship and sometimes kind of taking it down to the studs, going, all right, how do we build this back up? Because that whatever, we've just gone through something that was a bit miserable and a bit hard, but we have to keep working together. So what are we going to do to make this work?
Mm. And with the Keystone conversations, I kind of picture it in my head as being an ongoing thing rather than a kind of once-off thing. How regularly would you recommend having these? As kind of like not a reset, but almost like a reminder of what we need to think about.
Well, it's certainly helpful to have it as soon as possible in the working relationship. So great if you're just starting to work with somebody, or you've started working with a new vendor, or you moved into a new role. People worry that, like, okay, but I'm working with a whole bunch of people and I've been working with them for a while. Have I missed my chance? I'm like, no, it's like, as the saying goes, the best time to plant an acorn is 20 years ago, and the second best time to plant it is today. So you can say, hey, Roz, I love working with you for the last 9 months. This is great, but can we just take a moment to step back and just go, how are we doing? Is there anything we could be doing better together to make our work even more successful and happier as well? I think it's often useful if there's a shift in circumstances. So like Ainsley on my team, and at the bestpossiblerelationship.com, you can see me role modeling this conversation with Ainsley, but she has just been promoted into a more senior role, greater expectations. And we went through a Keystone conversation and filmed it, because even though we've been working for 4 years together, we're like, things are different. Things need to shift. And so you're right. You don't need to do this, every week. Doing it once is great. But then what's important is this ongoing checking in. Hey, how are we doing? Hey, should we stop something, start something, amplify something? What needs to be different? What needs to be said that hasn't been said? There's all sorts of ways that you can lead an ongoing, let's put the work aside, let's put the urgency aside, let's look at each other's eyes and go, how's it going between the two of us right now? Do we need to tweak anything?
Mm. And I love that concept of it becoming an organic conversation rather than every time going, I better go get my script out and we're going to sit down and answer the same questions that we did 6 months ago.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that, changing it up and it just becoming the way we do things.
Yeah. And, when you come back to the questions, you don't have to kind of go, I'm going to tell you again what I'm best at, when I shine and when I'm flow. But you could say, it's really interesting. In the last 6 months, I've really noticed that this is becoming more and more of a sweet spot for me. So I want more of this and less of that. So you can refine your answers and kind of deepen your knowledge with each other.
Now, I work quite a lot with organisational culture, so I'm just really super interested to hear from you what you've actually seen in terms of this model transforming organisational cultures, or where you see it going in the future.
Yeah, it's a big question, because transforming organizational cultures is a hard, tricky thing. And they rarely it's not like painting a house where you're like, the walls were green and now we've painted them to be a delightful shade of beige. And so we're now consistently beige through there. An organizational culture is made up of a whole bunch of kind of aligned subcultures, so the culture in sales is going to be different from the culture in R&D within the culture of the bigger organization as well. So I'd say a couple of things. One is, the place to start is not with trying to shift your culture, it's trying to shift your current relationships at an individual level. To shift a culture, there needs to be a business reason why this might be important. Like if we're trying to unweird the idea of psychological safety and trying to also allow psychological bravery, then I'm like, but for the sake of what? And I know there's the more broad for the sake of humanity, which I agree with. But, you know, for instance, if I take my learning from trying to influence organizational cultures to be more coach-like, which is a lot of the work that happens through the Coaching Habit book, you know, the company we've had the most success with and made the greatest contribution to is Microsoft.
Mhm.
And that was helpful because Satya Nadella said, we need to shift the culture because we need to sell differently and we need to be different and we need to move from a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture. So the CEO put this idea of curiosity at the heart of a business strategy and therefore a culture. And so I'm able to go, look, let me teach you coaching skills as a busy manager and a leader for business reasons and cultural reasons. So the question I would be interested in is going, so if how to work with almost anyone feels important, for the sake of what is it worth trying to shift a more general way of how we all work together in an organization?
Yeah, with the trust and vulnerability piece, which is this, if we can make organizations safer places to work, where people can talk about what's really important, what's really going on for them, and then people make better decisions and they perform better, and you know that leads then to better organizational outcomes. I can see a really clear link between, you know, this book and creating great organizational outcomes.
Well, I think so too. You know, the other avenues of discussion we've been having so far are around diversity, inclusion, and belonging, which is like, so how do you do that? How do you make somebody feel that they belong? Well, one reason is you have a conversation and say, tell me about who you are. Tell me how we bring out your best. You know, there's the move to hybrid and everybody going, God, it's hard to build a team at the best of times. Now we're doing a hybrid, it's even more confusing. This could be a great contributor to that. And then even things like you know, within organizations there's often project managers, which is like, it's my job to try and make all this stuff happen. And I'm like, yeah, you're really good with Excel spreadsheets, but the people bit's annoying, isn't it? This might help. This can help you with some of that. You know, in the end, work happens through people. And then the other phrase that people will have heard of is, you know, people join organizations, but they leave managers. So don't be that manager. Don't have that manager. And so one way it shifts cultures is you keep your best people because you are building relationships that matter to them.
And then you attract better people because, you know, reputation flows out. People talk. If they had a bad experience inside an organization and they leave, they will tell people, you know, and likewise, if they had a really good relationship, you want people to be talking about their workplace really positively so other people want to come and work there. So this, you know, I just see huge applications. I was really excited about this, actually. I read it and kind of went, there's so many really great applications to, you know, changing culture, changing the way we work, you know, absolutely loved it. So in terms of finding you and finding your resources, how can people get in touch?
If you're interested in kind of some of the corporate coaching training, then there's a company called boxofcrowns.com that I founded. That's the best place for that. If you're more interested in me and the books that I write, mbs.works is the website for that. And that's a hub for downloads and book support and book resources and social media and all of that good stuff.
And of course, social as well. You're across all the social platforms.
I am, yeah. Instagram in particular and LinkedIn are the two ones where I put most effort. I'm kind of I have no space left on connections on LinkedIn, but you can follow me and I write a weekly newsletter on LinkedIn and Instagram. There's a ton of kind of teaching that happens on Instagram as well. So if any of this feels useful, sign up.
Definitely. So yeah, absolutely love this book. I also love the Coaching Habit.
Thanks,
so highly recommend that one as well. Thank you so much for your time. This has been really, really interesting. I've really loved unpacking the book with you.
My pleasure. Thanks for such great questions.
Thank you, Michael.